Genesis 27. We're going to be getting into the very end of that chapter and then jumping into Jacob's story tonight. Last week we looked at Isaac and his sojourning in Gerar, and we got the major event of last week was the deception, where having already obtained the birthright from his brother through bowl of soup, Jacob now deceives his brother Esau for the blessing. So we're going to be looking at the Esau's response to all of that at the end of chapter 27, and then on into 28, 29, and 30. Just want to batteries. Yes, sir. I'm using all the batteries up. It's all right.
Well, that's what happened.
I'm with that being said, we're going to have a prayer here in just a moment. But before we do, Dennis had mentioned to me that he was informed David Haley's situation. It was mentioned he was in ICU at Brookwood this morning, but it's turning out to be more serious than we initially thought. So just please, everybody, be in prayer for him. And Al's going to lead us in prayer here in just a moment. Al, if you specifically pray for David and their family and his health and the medical team looking after him, that would be appreciated. So, Al, if you would. Amen. Thank you, Al. When hardship, whatever form it may take, strikes, there's no better place to be than in the hands of the Lord. And certainly we know that he's with David now, and we just entrust David and every one of us, our well-being and our care to the Lord. So he's as much with us, and we are as dependent on him, on the Lord, as he is. So Mike had a couple comments he wanted to make, kind of touching back into the last lesson, and then moving forward, we'll go ahead, and it just transitions nicely right into tonight's lesson. So,
Yeah, some of the things I was reading before last week, and it's one of those moments where teachers say, you start home, you think, I've got to make that point. But I was reading in some stuff, and it said, why did God always use imperfect people to progress through his plan? And then one of the comments back was that, well, if he didn't use imperfect people, who would he use? And I was telling Lisa, the benefit to that and for us is that imperfect people has always been a part of God's plan as long as we do God's will. And so that's the benefit in it for us as we travel through life. We're not perfect, won't ever be, but if we try and then we follow God's plan, then we're going to be a part of his plan. That's right. And then the second thing that I wanted to talk about was, I got thinking about the spiritual blindness, about Isaac and him being blind and being deceived. And that's where we are sometimes, and Billy talks a lot about it when he makes some comments over here about Satan and the deception that's in the world, about how we can be deceived from good is evil and evil is good. And that's exactly what happens when we get spiritual blindness around us. And when we don't stay in God's word and know what's good and evil, we allow that spiritual blindness to come around us, and then we're deceived by it. So I just thought that's a good comment to make about how we saw Isaac deceived because he couldn't see. You know, he had the questions about it, but they convinced him, no, this is good, when it wasn't. So,
Far better to be physically blind and unable to see than to not be able to see one's spiritual condition and the things going on around you, right?
hey, amen.
So.
That's it. And then the third thing is we see, and we'll see that tonight, sin always has consequences. And tonight, as we pick up, we'll see that Rebekah and Jacob are both going to have some repercussions of the decisions they made. And tonight, we'll just lead into Rebekah's part of it in the first part of the story tonight when Esau has vowed to kill Jacob. And she goes back into Isaac to me, with another deceptive plan that she goes in there and says, well, you know, if Jacob marries one of these Hittite women, you know, what will I do? I'll just die. And so that's another plan for her to get Jacob to send him away. And so anyhow, so the deception just continues on and on and on. And so that's the story picks up tonight with that being a part of it, is her plan to get Isaac to send Jacob away. And the first question, and we're doing questions we'll go through. Yeah, how about that? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? So there is the first question, what did Esau resolve to do to Jacob, and what did Rebekah do to protect him? Okay, and why did he want to kill him? What caused that? Okay. Did he steal it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I think that's insight too to truly how unspiritual Esau was. We mentioned this a couple of times along the way. How one, he's willing to sell his birthright for a bowl of soup, and then he goes and he marries the Hittite women, the Canaanites of the land that was not part of God's plan for that family. And now, where does this take you back to? I'm going to kill my brother. Yeah, Cain and Abel. We're talking about, you know, seed of the serpent, and I mean, Esau is that's the line that he's walking. That's the path that he's choosing. And I find it interesting, and I don't think we'll get to this until next week. But there seems at some point in time to become a change in him. But he is going the wrong way right now in the choices that he's making. And it makes sense that Jacob is the one that God has chosen, and Esau, because of the choices that he makes, just he's showing himself to be unworthy, and that God was right to pass over him. Dennis? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just a complete lack of interest in anything spiritual, right? And so it just leads to a series of choices that, because he doesn't have this faith in God, truly is what it boils down to, that it affects the decisions he makes along the way.
And what started this problem in the first place between Rebekah and Isaac and Jacob and Esau? Favoritism. Okay, so we see from the beginning what favoritism can cause. We can see it cause divisions in families, and we see it here. We can see favoritism cause division in churches, and probably most of us that are older has seen that happen in places. And but the worst part, is churches and homes that you see it. You see it at work, and we see it time and time again through the Bible where people have shown favoritism and it's caused problems. So, but that's where it starts, and then one sin just progresses into another as we go through that. Okay, any other comments about that? Okay, this is where I think Rebekah starts paying for hers, because to my knowledge, and y'all correct me, the Bible never says that she ever saw Jacob again after she left, and that was her beloved son. That was her basically pride and joy. So once she sends him away, to our knowledge, she never sees him again. So that would be part of her punishment, like, so to speak, for her deception. Al? Okay, yeah. Lauren? That's right. Any other comments? Okay. So once Rebecca tells him tells Isaac that she needs him to send him away, and he brings Jacob in, and then he starts telling him, he's going to send him away not to marry a Canaanite woman, and he wants to send him back to Bethuel home, and then to look for Laban and to marry one of his daughters, one of his kin people. And before he sends him away, though, he gives him his blessings, that he wants God to continue that blessing through him. But so the next question that we see is, how did Isaac bless Jacob before he left for his uncle Laban's house? And what did y'all get out of that? How was his blessings toward Isaac for that?
One thing to note is this was not a deceptive blessing here. Isaac knew exactly who he was blessing. And he's come to terms with Jacob is going to be the son of God. Ask that God give him the promise that he gave.
And that's what I saw. His prayer to God to bless Jacob through him. And then the next question, a few minutes later, a few verses down, we'll see that God actually concludes those blessings. Luke.
Things going on, he's being driven out of the land. We see that as a recurring theme throughout the entire story. And so let's not miss. This is one of the earliest times where sin drives out God's people from the land, and things have to be redeemed or reconciled later on so that they can be allowed to come back into it.
Good point, yeah. Any other comments? Okay, so he's on his journey back to Haran, and we had showed that on a map just a few weeks back and said, hey, remember this place, because it's not long until somebody else is going to be journeying back here looking for a wife. So on his way back, it looked like it's about halfway between Hebron and going back to Haran, that he spent that night where he had his dream, looked like. So that would have been about halfway, and we said last time it's somewhere 424 or 500 mile journey between the two places, depending on exactly where he was at when he left from. So, but anyway, so he bedded down that night, spent the night, and got him a rock for a pillow, and went to sleep, and then he had a dream. What was his dream? Anybody remember?
Peggy?
Okay. And what was that a symbol of? Anybody have any ideas about that, or thoughts on that? what the angels going up and down would communicate? Yeah. One of the things that I thought about when I read that is, and we've seen at different times in the biblical days where dreams actually meant something. And so how many times in our lives have we had a dream and we woke up the next morning? I mean, it was kind of real to us, and we kind of had some weird feelings about it for a few days. What does this mean or anything? So
Jacob is going to conclude, his conclusion is the presence of God is here. And so he calls the place Bethel, which means house of God. And actually, it's interesting to see how Jesus is going to, if Jesus has, this is perhaps one of the clearest presence of Jesus in Scripture. Were you going there with that?
yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay. But in John chapter 1, where Jesus is calling the apostles and he's talking to Nathanael, it's in John 1, verse 51. He said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you'll see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." That's kind of hearkening back to this dream that Jacob has where he sees the angels going up and down. And I think what we're to take away from that is Jesus is the means by which heaven comes down to earth, if you will. And it's the means by which we go up to heaven to be with God. So Jesus is the mediator from heaven to earth and from earth to heaven. And so I think you see Jesus tying that in and helping us understand, at least maybe giving us a fuller understanding of how he was the fulfillment of that, while Jacob grasped something more immediate. We're able to see how Jesus ties himself in with that means by which heaven comes to man and man goes to be with God.
Yeah. And also, the next day is when God speaks to him and reaffirms or reconfirms the promises that he had actually made back to Abraham, and then he recommitted them to Isaac. And now this is the third time that we've seen God recommit his promises of the land, seed, and nations through the descendants as they come down. Crawford.
It talks about how all throughout not priests, that's not the right word, but words to minister to God in the picture that here where a place that connects heaven to earth there.
Okay. And this is, again, as we've mentioned, this is where God comes to him and recommits that he's going to be the one to continue the promise that he started with Abraham. And so what does Isaac do before he leaves this place? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. And yeah, okay. And then once he done that and renamed the place, then what did he do? Did he have like a conversation with God?
Makes a vow to him, doesn't he?
He makes a vow. Yeah, he did. But I thought it interesting, as you read through the way the Bible's worded, it was kind of like, I guess, thought back to Abraham with Sodom and Gomorrah, when he was reasoning with God, what about this, what about that? And then, I kind of thought that with Jacob when he started saying, if you'll do this, I'll do this. And
Kind of feel like that's not the best showing of Jacob's faith. And I think Jacob is an interesting character because you're going to see a significant transformation over the course of his life.
yeah,
But you look at the promise God makes him, and this is prior to him anointing the rock and then making the vow to God. But in verse 15, God tells him, "I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I promised." And so God tells him, I'm going to take care of you. And just prior to that, he gives him the blessings of Abraham in verses 13 and 14, that is the land and the seed. So he tells him, I'm going to be with you, take care of you, bring you back. And then Jacob, even after that, rather than accepting that in faith, what does he do? But he says, okay, God, you do this for me and I'll do this for you. So you do what you already said you're going to do, and if you do that, then you'll be my God. And I think one of the distinctions between both Isaac and Jacob is Abraham. Abraham seemed to have a faith that didn't need those same kind of reassurances. And I know I believe Abraham struggles along the way with his, but with Jacob, after already having been told that, he says, God, if you'll stay with me and do everything you said you were going to do, then you'll be my God. So, just kind of an interesting dynamic when you consider the response of these patriarchs to the Lord and the promises that He makes.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think this is kind of a turning point for me in Jacob's life. We see this as he's starting into a transition to.
I think this is the first step, and I think he's gonna make some good progress along the way.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments about that? But that goes back to what Lauren said earlier. God's going to use you to do His plan, no matter if we are flawless or we kind of get off track a little bit. He's going to get us back on, or allow us to get back on. Joe.
This is where Jacob's faith ceases to be Abraham's, and it's becoming his own. This is the point that Jacob's Lord. Which everybody does that. Jacob's messed up. There's no question about that. But I've always read this him buying in.
I think it's a turning point, but it's verse 20. He says if. So I mean, I think it's a step in the right direction, and we're going to say, I think it's next week, that he's going to come back to Bethel, if you will, and I think that's really where his faith grows and leaps and bounds, and it's quite possible that this is more, rather than a stipulation, more just a restating, if you will, and so that's within the realm of possibility. There's a lot of deceit that's God's going to have to work out of Jacob, and he's going to do that. And I think along the way, up until he gets back to Bethel, there's going to be this clear demarcation where he says, okay, God is my God. And I think it's when he gets back to Bethel the second time, whatever idolatry he tolerated amongst his people, he's going to say, bring them out. We're done with that. And he's going to be all in, but maybe he's anteing up here, if nothing else, right? So, all right.
We're transitioning into the next section. I can't help but think about two things. One, kind of the old Andy Griffith, the old statement he used to make is, let's see, how did it go about being deceived? Thank you. That was it. Yeah. That's I think about that a lot, and there's a lot of truth in that. And then I think the second one, which is the spiritual one, is the Galatians 6 verses 7 and 8. Don't be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will to the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And I think about that in these deceptions, because we're fixing to see as we move in now, Jacob is fixing to get deceived, just like he deceived his father. So, and that's the next section we'll move into in question 5. What were the names of Laban's 2 daughters, and how are they described? But before we get there, where did they meet? Where did Jacob meet Rachel at? At the well. And as you read about that was a common place for the women in all the areas to come to in the evenings to get water for the families. So that was a common meeting place. We saw Jesus meet the woman at the well. We saw,
Rebecca.
Thank you. Too many names here. Rebecca, when Isaac went, or the servant went, he met her at the well. So it was, and that was it. It's just a common meeting place for the women to come to get water to the water for the family and stuff, okay? All right, so what were the daughters' names? Leah and Rachel. And what was, how were they described? Okay.
Let's get some commentary on that. I know we probably all got individual thoughts. What does that mean? Thoughts? Can't just say it, can you? Can't just say it, can you? Yeah. Okay. Well, what do we have over here?
No, yeah,
Well, it's just I agree with that statement because she's contrasted with Rachel, who is beautiful in form and appearance, but Leah had weak eyes. So whatever that meant, something about her eyes was unattractive. So we don't know exactly what it was, and I read a fair bit on this, and I've read about it in the past. Apparently, in that culture, big brown eyes is, and you can go through cultures and times and different attributes of, are attractive. And it kind of, what's attractive here is not necessarily attractive in another place at a different point in time. So big brown eyes was attractive among the people of that time and place. And so some have thought, well, her eyes were a lighter colored. Maybe it was as simple as her eyes being blue or green, and so not being as appealing. Having a squint, from any of those things to being cross-eyed even, for that matter. So whatever the case seems to have been, you got Rachel here who's a looker, and Leah is unattractive because something to do with her eyes. We don't know exactly what it was, but it seems to have been largely related to that.
They seem to be similar in form, because he didn't know that the next morning that it was somebody else. So
Would we be presuming? Would I be presuming too much to wonder maybe Jacob didn't go to bed quite sober that night? I don't know.
Well,
when weddings were like back then and all of that.
Yeah,
But
and the question I had, it was custom for them because we saw back when Rebecca saw Isaac come and she veiled herself, right? So, I was wondering maybe if that was a custom for the women to be veiled until after they
yeah, that's a good point.
So that was another one. But Lisa said, well, even if they were veiled, they had a thing for their eyes. So they said her eyes was the problem. So, but, it was dark. It wasn't like we grew up now. When the sun went down, it was dark. They didn't have night lights and stuff. But,
Yeah.
yeah. But there, you could spend a lot of time just trying to figure this stuff out. Did anybody look and try to figure out what their ages were at this time?
Well, we know how old Jacob is, but I don't know that we know how old they are. Do you have you know how old they are?
Well,
Was there any?
I never could confirm it, but I saw some pretty good speculations from some other things. But they thought they were about 14 at this time, and then so that when he worked 7 years, they would have been 21. Does anybody ever thought about if they were twins or not? That's something else I'd read and heard, and been a lot of discussion about they thought they were twins because they were so similar. Maybe like you said in form.
Yeah.
So but that's just a side thought. But the ages, but I just thought that was weird that they were that young. I wasn't thinking of being that young, but they were thinking somewhere in their early 20s when they got married. And then Jacob would have been how old?
He's 77 right now.
There you go. So
Wow.
been 84 when they got married. Yes. Well, it said.
I think
Well, I'm thinking the
Esau
same
and
thing.
Jacob. I think Esau would have made a big deal out of it, being the older twin, right? So
Yes, that's what I'm saying. The oldest
Yeah.
and the customs back then. With
So-
it. That was the thing I think that brought the question to my mind is, the oldest and youngest, and I could see Jacob being, well, you done that to your brother, so anyway. It's more that what goes around comes around. We got to
Yeah.
get moving, haven't we? Take over. You
Me?
want to?
I kind of like the pace you're going at.
We're not going to
So,
finish.
yeah, we had some interesting. You might be able to criticize this class, but I don't think you can say it wasn't interesting tonight. So, all right. So at the beginning of chapter 29, Jacob meets Rachel at the well. She's a shepherdess. I kind of like what seems to me to be a feat of strength whenever Jacob rolls the rock off the well. We talked about him being kind of a quiet guy, and I think if you just see him maybe as a mama's boy, then I think you miss the picture of Jacob. I think he's quite the fella. it seems to me it'd be a strength of feet because the shepherds are there and they say, hey, we normally wait till everybody's here and then we roll the rock off. That kind of sounds to me like this is a big rock. And it takes all of us to get to move the rock. Maybe it was more of a timing thing and we just want to wait till everybody's here so we're not leaving it exposed any longer than necessary. But whenever he sees Rachel come up, he rolls the rock off, he kisses her, and then he sends word as to who he is. And so it's from there that he's introduced into Laban. And it doesn't take long before his interest in Rachel manifests, and he says, I want him to marry Rachel. What's the price? And he says, I'll work for you for 7 years. So we know the events that transpire. He works 7 years, and kind of an interesting comment there that says those 7 years passed as a day out of his love for Rachel. So all good love stories begin at a well, don't they? So we kind of see that with Rebecca and Abraham's servant. We see that here with Jacob and Rachel. So anyway, Laban pulls the wool over his eye, and that night they go to bed, wake up in the morning. Behold, it was Rachel. And so just the irony of that, the deceiver is deceived. What goes around comes around. And so Jacob, rightfully so, is angry at Laban, says, what were you doing deceiving me? At some point in time, the irony of this entire situation has to fall on Jacob, and he has to say, okay, I deserve that. But anyway, he still loves Rachel, still wants to marry Rachel, and says, okay, I want to marry Rachel. Laban says, fulfill her week, and then you can marry Rachel as well. So he says, but you got to work another 7 years. So he ends up getting 14 years and 2 wives. Best deal, I don't know, I think that's probably debatable what kind of deal he got, but.
Jacob back to Bethuel/Laban's family. And what would not have been as good is, so we talk about Esau taking an Ishmaelite for a wife. I don't know if they were even a nation yet. He went to literally Ishmael, the person who came directly from his father. And so I don't know exactly the significance other than they weren't to be Canaanites, but some of Abraham's lineage had become in that Canaanite category.
Yeah. I think you see Esau there trying to curry favor with his dad because he saw that it pleased him, or maybe he heard some of the comments about the wives that he took. But his failure to understand, and I think this is a demonstration of Ishmael's failure when he marries, or Esau's failure when he marries an Ishmaelite or a daughter of Ishmael, is Ishmael was the rejected one, remember? And so you've got the rejected one marrying into the family of the rejected. And so if he were aware of the story and he were more spiritually perceptive, he probably wouldn't have made that move. But I think that, again, that's a demonstration of his spiritual blindness, that he just wasn't able to see and comprehend and appreciate the blessings of God and the promises of God. Crawford?
The moment Esau marries the Ishmaelite seems to be kind of the thing, besides the birthright, seems to be kind of the thing that seals the deal that he is cut off from the family of God, like you said. And I think that's interesting because that serves almost as an analogy for the Israelites who are told over and over not to marry outside the family of God, because that will be the promise that you just continue to be cut off from among your people. You see that happen with Esau.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, and you see it happen repeatedly with Israel, and every time it just never ends up well, right? And so, yeah, I think Esau was kind of almost the progenitor of all of that. So, and you see, part of it was significant for the family of Abraham to marry within those, not marry among the Canaanites and the unbelievers, but those who at least were worshipers and believers of God. And it seems like Rachel and Leah were, although Rachel perhaps not exclusively, as we'll see a little bit later on. All right, verse 31 of chapter 29. So there, Jacob now has 2 wives, and he's serving Laban for 14 years. So this seems to be after the first 7 years. He goes ahead and receives Rachel to be his wife, and he's going to work, indebt himself another 7 years to Laban. Verse 31, we begin to see the tension begin to grow. And you can only imagine, again, this, I was talking to Al before Bible class, this had to be one of the most miserable families to have ever lived. When and ladies, you can probably appreciate can you imagine you and your sister being married to the same man? And it seems like how awful. You're going to see the bitterness, you're going to see jealousy, you're going to see envy, you're going to see infighting. And it's interesting if we get to the end, we'll look at the names of the children that they have. and it really tells the story of the relationship and the contention that just took place in this family. But verse 31 says, and Alan said, how would you like to have been a judge over that situation where you've got this man who's married to two sisters? And God was the judge over that. Verse 31, when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Okay, and so when God sees that Jacob has a strong preference, and remember, he's coming from a family where favoritism was part of what he was used to, where he was a favorite of his mother, and his brother was a favorite of his father. Now he's got a favorite wife, okay? And that's what's meant there when it says that Leah was hated. Not literally, I don't think that she was hated, but that she was the unloved one. She was not the one that Jacob desired. Anyway, when God sees that, he looks down and sees Leah's plight. He gives her children, and Rachel remains barren. And so, the first 4 sons of Leah were who? Okay, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. All right, so God evens the scales, if you will. And it's interesting, too, to see the names, because and you just have to feel sorry for Leah. When Reuben, she names him Reuben. The Lord has looked on my affliction, for now my husband will love me. So what wife doesn't desire the love of her husband, and yet she doesn't have it? And so she has a son, she names him Reuben to commemorate, maybe my husband will love me now that I've given him a son. And understanding the significance of that. She conceived again, bore a son. Because the Lord has heard that I'm hated, he'll give me this son also. So one son didn't work, I'll give him another son. Maybe he'll love me now. Not to be the case. Again in verse 3, this time my husband will become attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. So you hear in the naming of these children, just the cry of the spurned and unloved wife. Okay? And finally, after Judah is born, she names her 4th son Judah. This time I'll praise the Lord. So it's interesting too to see in the naming of the children the faith of these individual women begin to emerge. And rather than I've given my husband a 4th son now, surely he'll love me, it's this time I'll praise the Lord. Okay, and so her focus shifts from off of her being rejected to now looking toward the Lord. So as we're going to see, Mike, you have anything on that you want to jump in with?
I'm good.
Okay, so as we're going to see, Rachel, there's envy within this family. She looks and she sees Leah's having all these babies, and she hasn't had any. She goes to Jacob in verse 1, give me children or I'm going to die. And Jacob pretty much reminds her, hey, God's in control of those things. Okay, God's sovereign over that. And he kind of pushes it back on her. Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So, very common event during this day and time. It's what happened with Hagar and Sarah, where a surrogate is taken and given when a woman is barren. So she says, take my maidservant Bilhah, and she'll vicariously bring 4 children for me through her. So Bilhah has 2 sons, as we're going to see, Dan and Naphtali. Leah stopped bearing at this point in time, and she says, hey, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So she takes her maidservant and gives it to Jacob, and she has 2 sons for her, that is Gad and Asher. So we see the growth of Jacob's family, and finally we're told a little bit later on, well, Leah's actually going to conceive again, isn't she? Kind of a strange story where Reuben's out in the field and finds some mandrakes one day, and Rachel sees them, and apparently they were connected to fertility, whether I imagine through superstition. And she says, hey, can I have some of those mandrakes? And this is before she's able to conceive. And as bad as this is, Leah says, okay, that's fine, but Jacob's going to spend the night with me. Okay, how terrible must that be, that she's willing to, or having to do that, something like that, to get the attention and affection of her husband. So anyway, she gives Rachel the mandrakes, and then Jacob comes in out of the field, and she says, hey, I bought you for the night, so you're staying in my tent. And anyway, through that she conceives and has 2 more sons, Issachar, which means wages are higher. So connected to the giving of the mandrakes, she's purchased her husband and conceives through that experience, and then bears another one named Zebulun. Luke? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, this had to be a most miserable household. We were studying with the kids tonight in preparation for class. Here's something that I learned. Okay, Jacob has a daughter. What's her name? Okay, Dinah. One daughter that's mentioned. It seems that Jacob probably had more daughters. And if you just think about it, I mean, I don't know what the odds. The odds may be 49-51 one way or the other, male or female. But it would be strange. And obviously, we understand sovereign God is overseeing these things. But it would just be statistically odd for a man to have 12 sons and one daughter. And I've always said, well, Jacob only had one daughter. But it seems like if you go to a couple passages, one in Genesis 37-35, one in Genesis 46, 6 and 7, the terms sons and daughters is applied to Jacob. Now, that would cause us to ask, well, why was Dinah mentioned? Well, the reason Dinah is mentioned specifically among his daughters, and so it wouldn't be strange for her to be the only one. We're going to need to know who she is, because as the narrative advances, there's going to be a very significant event that happens later involving Dinah. So we're kind of being introduced to her. We need to know who she is, so we're told her name specifically. But in both of those texts, we're told that Jacob had sons and daughters. And so statistically, it would make sense for him to have not just 12 sons and a single daughter, but multiple daughters. We don't know how many, but as to the relevance of the story, Dinah's the only one whose name that we need to know. So finally, at the midway through Genesis 30, verses 22 through 24, Rachel is finally able to conceive. Verse 22, then God, this is Genesis 30:22, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. So she's praying to God. That's a good thing, a positive thing. And God hears her prayer, and God remembers her and gives her a son. And so one more thing to remember is this is God's chosen people from whom Jesus is going to come into the world. And so the natural course of life doesn't play out as it ordinarily would, where a man and a woman get married and they conceive and they have children. With Abraham and Sarah, Sarah's barren. God has to heal her. With Isaac and Rebekah, 20 years, she's unable to conceive. God has to intervene. With Rachel, she's unable to conceive for we don't know how long it was exactly, maybe 14 years or so. She's unable to conceive. God has to help her. So from this is the seed that's going to come, the nation of Israel. This is not a nation born of the flesh, if you will. This is born through the power of God. And it's God fulfilling what God said He was going to do. When God said, I'm going to make you a great nation, He wasn't just talking about the fact that He was going to use them, but God is actually involved in this. And so you see His hands-on involvement in making this nation and overcoming the barrenness of each of these women to bring the people of God, the Israelites, into existence. So finally, Rachel was able to conceive. Verse 23, God has taken away my reproach, and she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. So this kind of just tells the story, and you see the sadness and the sorrow in this family. When you look at the names of the sons, and I put them up there, Reuben means see a son, and we kind of looked at how the naming of her first three children anyway were a reflection of her rejectedness and her being unloved. Then you get to the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaiden. They come next chronologically. Dan is judge, and so essentially saying God has looked at my case and has judged in my favor, and thus given me the son. Naphtali, I've wrestled with my sister and I've prevailed. I've got children now through my handmaiden. Okay, and so you see the tension that's taking place in the discontent. Again, Zilpah, Leah's handmaidens, good fortune and happiness. And then Issachar, wages and hire. That comes from the mandrake experience. Honor, surely my husband's going to honor me now. I've given him 6 sons. And so you just see the back and forth and with the disharmony. And this is what happens when you deviate from God's intended plan. What's God's plan for marriage? One man, one woman. Okay? And you see here a clear case where this is being violated. We know God tolerated things that He does not allow, that He has explicitly forbidden under this newer dispensation in which we're living. But this just does not work out well for family happiness. Okay, and so Jacob's miserable, Rachel's miserable. Maybe it's not presumptuous to me. I'm just listening to this story and reading it and looking at these names. And this entire family, they just seem to be quite an unhappy lot. And you can imagine why, because you've got this deviation from God's intended plan for the family, one man, one woman, husband, wife, children. Luke?
not just hurt, it's hurt that I am unloved.
Yep.
And so there's just so much weight that put in this
Mhm.
and the negativity that goes along with it. That out of Leah's children, even praise. There's
I think so. I think, yeah, and you look at how Jesus is going to emerge from that. And then from each of these two, if you will, there's going to emerge one significant tribe. That is the tribe of Judah, and that from Leah, and that is the tribe of Joseph, from or Ephraim from Joseph and Rachel's side. So you just see this continuing on, throughout the nation's history. So it's interesting to look at the story this tells, and I think it's interesting to see. I preached a sermon before how just on Rachel and Leah and what it says about them and what it says about their faith. But that'll have to wait till another time. So there's handouts in the back for next week's lesson. Go ahead and grab those on your way out. I very much enjoyed your thoughts and your comments in our class tonight.